Welcome everyone to Mishnah In-Depth Hullin with Rabbi Avie Walfish, part of the Rifka Rosenwein Mishnah Division at Drisha. This is the fifth and final class in the book of Hullin. We will be continuing with the Chorod, and I will have more details about that after the end of class. Sources for today's class will be shared on screen. It's been a pleasure having Rabbi Walfish back for these past few weeks. And with that, I'm going to hand the mic over to him.
Okay, thank you, Kayla. Okay, here we have the sources up. Okay, so we're starting the 8th chapter of Chulin. The chapter starts with Kol habasar asur levashel v'chalav chutz mibasar dagim v'chagavim. Okay, and so we see right off the bat, we're talking about the concept of basar b'chalav. Before talking more about this prohibition of basar b'chalav, let's talk a little bit about the opening of the chapter, because as we've seen, the previous chapters all opened with a formula. Okay, starting with chapter 5. Otovet beno noheg ba'aretz u'v'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit v'chulinu v'muktashim. Chapter 6 opens Kisui hadam noheg ba'aretz u'v'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit v'chulin aval lo b'muktashim. And chapter 7, the last chapter we studied last week, Gir hanasheh noheg ba'aretz u'v'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit v'chulin u'v'muktashim. We discussed this common opening at some length over the past couple of weeks. Okay, 3 chapters in a row with parallel openings, and these 3 halachot of otovet beno, not to slaughter an animal and its offspring on the same day. Kisui hadam, that when you slaughter a bird or a non-domestic animal, a kosher non-domestic animal, then its blood has to be covered. And gid hanasheh, the sciatic nerve, which is prohibited, okay, as commemoration of Yaakov's wrestling with the angel, being wounded in that area of his body, and as a result, his children took upon themselves, and it came enshrined as a commandment in the Torah not to consume that part of the thigh. So all these 3 mitzvot, okay, the opening formula of the 3 chapters is these mitzvot all apply whether in Israel or outside, whether in the presence of a temple or when there is no temple. And then the first variation is whether it applies to non-sanctified foods as well as to sanctified foods, meaning sacrificial foods. Okay, does it apply to both or only to chulin and not to muktashim? Kisui adam, for obvious reasons, is limited to chulin, because with regard to muktashim, which are offered as sacrifices, the blood has to be sprinkled on the altar. Okay, there's a very clear and specific purpose. It's regarding the chulin of chaya va'of. That's where we differentiate and say, for chulin, where the blood is not sprinkled on the altar, so it has to be covered. The other halachot, otovet beno and gir hanasheh, as we saw, do apply both to chulin and to muktashim. And these 3 chapters very clearly underscore a dominant theme, arguably the dominant theme of Masechet Chulin, which is that Chulin plays off kodshim. The very concept of slaughtering is a derivative from kodshim, as the Torah indicates in Dvarim chapter 12, and as the Mishnah alludes to in various shapes and manners and places. And these three chapters really underscore that theme. Here we have laws about that are relevant to slaughtering animals in order to consume them as food, laws regarding which the Mishnah makes very clear. These laws are not limited to the temple. And in some cases, such as Kisui Adam, they are limited to outside the temple. They're limited to secular eating of meat, non-sanctified eating of meat, and the others are not limited to that, but they apply to that as well. And that is a central theme in Hullin. So going back to the opening of chapter 8, we see that chapter 8 does not open with that opening. Okay? Kol abasar asur levashel b'chalav. We just start off with what is the prohibition? Okay? Do not cook it in milk, and then as the chapter progresses, we'll see it's not only prohibition against cooking, the prohibition extends far beyond that as well. Okay, but we're diverging from the opening. Okay, now you might say, okay, that's fine. In the first 6 chapters of Masechet Shabbat, 4 of the chapters open with a similar opening formula, Bama. Okay, in Sidurim it's usually written Bameh Madlikin, but in the Kaufman manuscript it's vowel pointed Bama. Bama Madlikin Uvama Ein Madlikim. And then that's chapter 2 of Tractates Shabbat, then chapters 4, 5, and 6 also open with Bama yes and Bama no. Bama Tomnin Uvama Ein Tomnim. Bama Bema Yotza Bama Ein Bema Yotza. Bama Isha Yotza Bama Ein Isha Yotza. Okay, so we have our 4 chapters with a similar opening. But that doesn't mean all the chapters before and after have to have the same opening as well. So we might just say that. But what does make this more intriguing is if you learned the Mishnah Yomit during the week, then you probably noticed that in chapter 10 we return to that kind of opening. Hazroav al chayayim v'akeva noagin ba'aretz u'v'chutz la'aretz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit b'chulin v'lo b'muktashim. And it's not only chapter 10, but chapters 11 and 12 as well. So we have here chapters 10, 11, 12, 3 additional areas of halacha, all of them relevant to our consumption of animals. So Azroav al chayayim v'akeva in chapter 10, we'll look at it more closely. We have that formula, and the same formula for Reshit HaGeiz, which means that when you shear your sheep, the first shearing of the sheep is dedicated to the Kohen. And then Shiluach Hakan, very well known mitzvah, of course, sending away the mother bird before you take its offspring for consumption. And again, Noheg Baratz v'chutzatz b'fnei habayit v'shelo b'fnei habayit. So if we put it all together, we have a grand total of 6 chapters which open with that formula. Okay? It's actually not the identical formula, but parallel formulae. Okay? 4 of them are b'cholin avalo b'muktashim. 2 of them are b'cholin uva muktashim. Right? But other than that detail, it's essentially the same formula. Continuation does diverge a little bit in these mishnayot, but we'll just focus on what's common. So that means a grand total of 6 chapters with the same opening within a tractate of 12 chapters. Okay, so of the last 8 chapters of the tractate, that's how 6 of them open. And given that, it is worth noting, it is somewhat remarkable, that in between chapter 7 that has the opening and chapter 10 that has that opening, there are 2 chapters that don't open with that opening. One of them being Kol HaBasar. Okay, now what makes that yet more remarkable is that in the Tosefta, now the Tosefta is a collection of Baraitot. Baraitot is best translated as external mishnayot. The Mishnah, as we have it, was compiled by Rabbi Yehuda Anasi from collections of Mishnah units. Okay, he gathered these collections, he assembled them, redacted them, put it into the shape that we have, and mishnayot that were not put into the canonical Mishnah, okay, many of them were later collected in collections of Baraitot, of external Mishnayot. Okay, one of the earliest of these collections was the Tosefta, which is designed as a kind of companion volume to the Mishnah. Okay, so it has many parallels to the Mishnah. The order is essentially the same as the Mishnah. There are many divergences, but by and large, the order pretty closely follows the order of the Mishnah. And very often, the Tosefta will bring you something that the Mishnah left out, and that highlights the fact that it was a conscious decision by Rabbi Yehuda Nasi to leave it out. And if you look at the Tosefta at the beginning of chapter 8, Basar b'chalav, noheg ba'aretz, uvechutz la'aretz, b'fnei habayit, v'shelo b'fnei habayit, b'chulin, uva'muktashin. So that opening was available to Rabbi Yehuda Nasi, and for whatever reason, he decided not to make use of it. And similarly, in chapter 9, we'll get to later, ha'or va'rotev, ha'kupa, va'alal, va'atzamot, va'gidin, etc. So we talk about different non-meat parts of the animal. Okay, they're parts of the animal, but they're not the meat, which is normally what's consumed. Okay, so mitztarfim l'tamei tumat ochlim, avalo tumat nevelot. Okay, so these things are considered to be food, so they will combine together to be susceptible to contracting impurity. Foods can contract impurity if they're exposed to a tuma source. Velo tumat nevelot, meaning the meat of an animal, if the animal is not slaughtered, if it dies without being slaughtered, then its meat has its own inherent impurity as a nevela. Okay, as a carcass which has the prohibition of nevela, as well as the impurity of a nevela. Okay, and these portions don't have tumat nevelot. They're not, only the real meat of the animal has tumat nevela, not these sort of adjuncts to the meat, but they are considered to be food. They are edible, they can be eaten, and therefore they are susceptible to tumat ochlim. So that's the opening of chapter 9, and again, without the formula of these laws all apply before the, inside Israel, outside Israel, and so on. All of that doesn't, it's not, here it's actually not really terribly applicable. But as we saw in chapter 8, it really is somewhat remarkable that the Mishnah chose not to emphasize this aspect of basar b'chalav. Okay, and basar b'chalav perhaps is more than other chapters in Hullin, maybe is in a way detached from this overall framework of comparing Hullin to Kodshim. And it always bears remembering in that connection, Hullin is the one tractate in all of Seder Kodshim that doesn't deal specifically with Kodshim. okay, that deals with the antithesis of Kodshim, which is Chulin, okay, profane or secular food, non-sanctified food, okay, and perhaps chapter 8, in a way, is like the quintessential Chulin topic, and the Mishnah doesn't want to highlight how it plays off of the laws of Kodshim, the way it has done with in many other places throughout the tractate, and most notably and remarkably in the 6 chapters that open with this opening formula. Okay, now another point about these 6 chapters. Chapters 8 and 9 that intervene between chapters 5, 6, 7 and chapters 10, 11, 12 effectively divide these 6 chapters into 2 units of 3, right? Now, we've already talked when we studied, in the past 2 weeks, we studied Otovet Beno, we studied Kisui Adam, we studied Gid Hanasheh, and we noted that these 3 concepts really have a lot in common. They really stem from certain common roots. Okay, they're all about sanctifying our secular eating, which is what Tractate Hullin is mostly concerned about. So Otovet Beno and Kisui Adam both represent our concern for animal lives. Yes, we will slaughter animals for consumption. That doesn't make us apathetic to the life of the animal. So Tovet Beno is a way of recognizing parental feelings, particularly perhaps maternal feelings, okay, towards offspring, and saying we have to slaughter in a humane fashion, and that includes don't slaughter mother and offspring on the same day. That's over the top. Kisui Adam, when we slaughter animals or birds that are not under our control, we don't support them in the way that we support our domestic animals. Okay, so then that gives us an opportunity and, in fact, demands of us that we express the fact that we feel somewhat guilty about taking the life of the animal. Yes, we take the life of the animal. That's legitimate, but we feel a twinge. We feel something wrong about it. Okay, and we express that by covering the evidence. We cover the blood. It's like hiding the evidence, as it were. Okay, and so Otovet Beno and Kisui Adam are both really very profound expressions of how, even while taking the animal's life, we do want to give a nod to, expression to, the fact that we're aware we took the life of an animal. We're aware that we somehow violated, something. We could even call it sacred. Okay, the life force of the animal, the parental instincts of the animal, and since we have violated that, we need to give it its due, give it some, at least symbolically, some kind of expression. Okay, Gid Hanasheh, we also talked about.
Excuse me.
Yes.
It comes to mind, the thing with Kansipor, Kolomer, Al Kansipor, Yagiu Rachamav, Mashdikinoto.
Yes.
So what do you do with that?
Okay. I'll get to that in a bit. Okay.
Okay.
Because
okay.
Shiluach Hakan is on our list here, so we will definitely be getting to that.
Okay.
Gid Hanasheh we spoke about,
Emma?
even though it seems to perhaps belong to a different realm, but as we analyzed the sources and the concepts underlying Gid Hanasheh, we did talk about Gid Anasheh as representing the paradox involved in the confrontation between physical, finite, frail, limited human beings, flesh and blood, and the divine, okay? The infinite, omnipotent, omniscient, okay, God. That was the confrontation between Jacob and the angel that gave rise ultimately to the prohibition of Gid Anasheh. You say also represents the idea that through our flesh we do, okay, as bound as we are by our fleshly being, okay, we do confront God. We do have our encounter with the divine, okay, and Gid Anasheh represents our awareness of that as well. Okay, so we're sanctifying our engagement with flesh. That's what Masechet Hullin is really all about. So that's how we analyze the connection among these three chapters. And now, if we look at the last three chapters, we're going to see some different emphases, especially in chapters 10 and 11. Okay, chapter 10, Azroav al Chayayim Va'Keva. Okay, what is that? Those are gifts that we give to the Kohen. Okay, Reshit Hagez is also a gift we give to the Kohen, in this case, without taking the animal's life. Okay, you shear the sheep, that's probably healthy for the sheep, and it's certainly healthy for our textile industry. Okay, we need to shear the sheep, okay, to get the wool, and for the sheep, it's certainly not dangerous, and it's probably healthy for him to be shorn every so often. Okay, so those we have to give gifts, specific gifts. When we slaughter an animal, we give certain portions to the Kohen. Okay, when we shear our sheep, we give the first shearings to the Kohen. Okay, and then Shiluach HaKein. Okay, so Shiluach HaKein certainly is very reminiscent of the mitzvot that we learned about in chapters 5 and 6. And in fact, the Mishnah at the beginning of chapter 12 explicitly compares Shiluach HaKein to chapter 6. It says, Chomer b'chisui adam mishiluach hakein, shekisui adam noeg b'chaya uva'of, b'mzuman uv'sheino mezuman. B'shiluach hakein eino noeg ela ba'of, eino noeg ela b'sheino mezuman. Okay, kisui hadam applies to non-domestic animals as well as birds, whereas Shiluach hakan applies only to birds. And only to birds we encounter in the wild, not birds that are within our purview, okay, that, say, nest in our backyard. If he's nesting in our backyard, there is no mitzvah of Shiluach HaKan. Okay, so here the Mishnah explicitly compares chapter 6 to chapter 12. Chapter 6 is the midpoint of the tractate, right? Chapter 12 is the end of the tractate, and we have an explicit comparison between them. And not an explicit comparison, but I would say an implicit comparison is with Otovet Beno. Otovet Beno and Shiluach HaKein are very often associated as two mitzvot that give expression to our concern for parental feelings. Okay, you send the mother away so as not to take the young in her presence. And if we slaughter the mother, we don't slaughter the offspring on the same day. So Otovet Beno applies to the animal. Shiluach HaKan applies to the bird. but they both give expression to the same kind of humane instinct that we want to cultivate. Okay, now Deborah asked from a Mishnah. It actually appears twice in Shas, once in Masechet Brachot, 5th chapter, and once in the 4th chapter of Masechet Megillah. The Mishnah says in both places, Haomer ad kan tzipor yagiu rachamecha mishadkim oto. If you say your mercy extends even to the nest of a bird, okay, if you say that as part of your prayer, if you have a chazan who says that's part of the prayer, then the community silences him. No, that's a wrong prayer. That's an improper prayer. Okay, so that Mishnah has been taken as indicating that, in fact, this mitzvah is not an expression of compassion for the animal at all. Because when we say, you have compassion upon the bird, then the community is supposed to say, no, you can't say that. Why not? So in the Talmudic discussion as to why not, one very famous explanation that's offered in the Talmud is ki ein mitzvotav sha'kadosh baruch hu rachamim ela gzerot. Okay, God doesn't command us these commandments because he is merciful, but because he decrees, which many have understood to mean we don't do mitzvot because we feel compassion. We do mitzvot because we're commanded to. Okay, the consciousness of the person carrying out a mitzvah should be, God commanded, I obey. Now, I might identify more with the mitzvah, or I might identify less with the mitzvah. Sometimes there are mitzvot I perform, and I feel it's very much the right thing to do. Sometimes I do mitzvot, and I say, if I had my druthers, I don't think I would be doing this. I don't feel entirely right doing this mitzvah, but what can I do? Okay, God has commanded, I have to obey. And ultimately, the motivating factor should be because you are a commanded being. Okay, or as Chazal put it in a very famous midrash, Am Yisrael said Naaseh v'nishma. First Naaseh and then Nishma. One of the meanings of Nishma is not just to hear, but to understand. We will do, and then we will try to comprehend. Now, first, carry out the order. Once I've committed myself to carrying out the order, I can then reflect on trying to understand why I was given this commandment. Why is it that I'm supposed to be doing this? Okay, but first you have to be commanded. So that's a popular understanding of that Mishnah. Okay, however, there are other ways already in the Talmud of explaining the Mishnah. And personally, I think that the likeliest explanation of the Mishnah is one that doesn't really appear in the Talmud. And that is that it's one thing for us to ascribe certain motivations to the commandments. It's another to employ that in prayer. It could very well be that God's command about Shiluach HaKahan is an expression of compassion. However, we can't turn to God and say, you have compassion upon the mother bird, and God could, in effect, say back to us, oh, is that how you understand my commandment? Who says, maybe I had other motivations? Because we can't when we pray to God, we will refer to attributes of God. We'll say to him, you are this way. You are a compassionate God. You have expressed your compassion in doing X, Y, and Z. Okay, when we say, for example, as part of our slichot, okay, the God who answered the prayers of Abraham, okay, let him answer us. The God who answered the prayers of Daniel, God who answered the prayer of Jonah, and so on. We're referring back to instances where God exemplified certain attributes and we put them into our prayers. But to put an interpretation of a commandment into our prayers, even if we're convinced that it's the right interpretation, we can't be so firmly convinced. We'll say to God, you have to have mercy on us because you had mercy even on the mother bird. And God can say, I had mercy? Who said? Maybe I had other motivations for Shiloh HaKan. The Kabbalists have suggested various motivations for on a Kabbalistic level of uniting different sfirot, which is why in the Kabbalistic world, Shiloh HaKan is a mitzvah you should actively seek to perform. Seems to me to fly in the teeth of what the Torah and Chazal seem to indicate, which is if you want to be cruel to the young of this mother bird, so at least send her away first. But you don't have to be cruel to the young, and then you also don't have to send away the mother. Okay, but in the Kabbalistic tradition, it became actually a kind of mitzvah that you should go out and seek to perform. You should try to look for opportunities to perform it. So if that's the correct explanation, it's certainly incorrect to address that to God. And even if you accept that particular explanation of the Talmud, I think the best explanation of what the Talmud has in mind was offered by Ramban. Ramban on the mitzvah of Shiloh HaKan has a lengthy discussion where he discusses Rambam's explanation of it in the guide, and Rambam's explanation was because God had mercy on the mother bird, and Rambam said, and you may ask from this Mishnah, well, that's just one opinion to interpret the Mishnah in that way, and I follow one of the other interpretations. But Ramban, I think, has a much more incisive answer to that question, which is that when the Talmud suggests that mitzvot are not expressions of divine mercy, but are divine decrees, that doesn't mean that there isn't a rationale. But it does mean that the rationale is not God having mercy on the bird. Because if God really had mercy on the bird, what he would be commanding us to do is don't take the young at all. Spare them. That's having compassion. Taking the birds, slaughtering them, but just sending the mother away first, that's not real compassion. What is it, says Ramban? It's educating us to feel compassion. Now this, by the way, I've effectively been following that line of thought all through our study of Tractate Hullin, because I've repeatedly talked about how even though shchita in its essence is cruel, it's not humane, but the many halachot that try to humanize it, try to introduce an element of humaneness and compassion
They
into the
temper
act of
it.
shchita are to give symbolic expression to the importance of compassion. Yes, sometimes we have to be cruel, but even when we are cruel, we should give symbolic expression to that compassion. Okay, another place where I see a similar idea is in the mitzvah of Bal Tashchit. The Torah tells us not to destroy fruit trees, but in what connection? Connection with war.
Right. Ki
And
Adam
there seems
Eitz
to be
HaSadeh.
something paradoxical. We are setting out to take human lives. We are going to go to battle and kill human beings. And the Torah says, but don't destroy the fruit trees. Okay? What does that mean? Are the fruit trees somehow more important to us than human lives? Hardly. But we're in a situation where, for whatever reason, we feel that it's essential. It's essential for our survival. It's essential for our well-being. It's essential for realizing our divine destiny, whatever the rationale might be. Okay? But we feel that there is no choice. We are compelled to take human lives. But if we are compelled to take human lives, we do not throw compassion to the winds. We don't say, okay, we now turn into monsters, okay, who are going to commit October 7th style atrocities. We don't behave that way. Yes, we are taking human lives, but we remain human beings with the feelings that ought to animate human beings, and most significantly, feelings of humaneness and compassion. And therefore, we will not destroy fruit trees. For the war, if it's necessary for the war effort, by the way, we will. But we will not unnecessarily destroy fruit trees because we don't engage in vandalism. We're taking human lives, and we are still respecting the life force in the world as represented by fruit trees. I think it's a very similar kind of notion. I think it's very characteristic of the Torah. The Torah recognizes the foibles of human existence, including the fact that we do have to engage in acts of cruelty. It's part of being part of the biological and natural world. It's part of our interaction with other nations. Okay, we don't have a choice. Okay, we are compelled, as being part of this human reality, we are compelled to do things that are against our inner nature. But when we do that, we have to give at least symbolic expression to what our inner nature really demands. Okay, and that way we can retain our humanity even while we're acting at cross purposes to it. And I think that's a central theme in Tractate Hullin, and I don't think it's at all by accident that Tractate Hullin ends with this very dramatic expression of that idea in Shiluach HaKan, which, as I say, relates back both to chapter 6 and chapter 5, both to Kisui Adam and to Tovet Beno, and together these three chapters really give very dramatic expression to those ideas, okay, of humaneness and compassion. And again, within the framework where we're comparing Chulin to Kodshim. Okay, Kodshim is to sanctify. Okay, Kodshim is to worship God. They're also, by the way, by means of taking lives of animals, lives of birds, and we use that to worship God. And in Chulin, we are serving ourselves. But we have to sanctify that. We have to draw certain ideas and themes from Kodshim into our practice of consuming Chulin. Okay? And now let me get back to the difference between the first three chapters and the last three chapters. The main theme in these three chapters, at least two out of the three, is gifts to the Kohen. And that again plugs into the major theme of Chulin. Okay? Where do we know that we give gifts to the Kohen? In the temple. In the temple, certain parts of the sacrificial offerings are given to the Kohen. So
Matnot
too,
Kuhuna. It comes up in the Chumash.
okay, now some of the matnot kuna are within the framework of kodshim, but some of them are what we find here at the end of Hullin. Zroa l'chayayim v'keva are given to the Kohen, even though this is completely secular. There's no sanctity to the Zroa l'chayayim v'keva, but we give part to the Kohen. We give part to the Kohen of the shorn wool of the sheep. In other words, we assign the Kohen a role even when we eat chulin. So if we slaughter the chulin in a way that's representative, that's reminiscent of kodshim, we also involve the Kohen in our consumption of chulin, which is another way of reminding us that we have to sanctify, okay, our enjoyment of the world, and in particular of our enjoyment of products that we receive from the animal kingdom. Okay, so we assign the Kohen a role, and that helps remind us that we have to sanctify it. We're not doing it just for our own good. We have to somehow ennoble what we're doing, ennoble our consumption and our enjoyment of the world. And part of the way in which we do that is by how we conduct it. That's primarily in the first three chapters here, 5, 6, and 7. And obviously in the laws of Shechita themselves. But it's also in the involvement of the Kohen that's really emphasized in these last three chapters. Now, when we talk about the role of the Kohen as playing a major role in Chulin, I think we almost automatically think about the next tractate that you'll be studying. I'll be leaving you next week, but you'll be starting Masechet Bechorot, and the Bechor is one of the gifts to the Kohen. That's a
Can I
major
ask you a
theme in
question?
Bechorot, is giving gifts to the Kohen. So the end of Chulin is already looking forward to the beginning of Bechorot. If we have time later on this evening, we'll see some more tie-ins between the end of Chulin and the beginning of Bechorot. If not, you can see them for yourselves on the source sheets. Yes, Deborah.
I wanted to ask you, when it talks about the chulin and giving it to the Kohen, does the Kohen, let's say you have a Kohen in your neighborhood, so you want to eat some meat that you shechted, so you give him the zroa l'chayayim and the keva. He can eat
Yeah.
it in his own home, or does he
Yes.
have to go up to he doesn't have to go up to the mikdash or the mishkan?
Right, and there are also no restrictions about eating it in impurity. If the Kohen is impure, he can eat it. If the
Okay,
food becomes impure, he can eat it. No restrictions.
good, thank you.
Okay, now I want to spend some time looking at chapter 8, which to my mind is one of the most interesting chapters, if not the most interesting chapter in Tractate Hullin. Okay, it divides quite neatly into two parts. 6 mishnayot, which divide neatly into 3 and 3. Okay, and let's see how we can see that. So Mishnah 1 starts with Kol habasar asur levashel bechalav, and continues with asur la'aloto im hagvina al hashulchan, which is a big jump. The Torah says you are not allowed to seethe the kid in its mother's milk. And the first Mishnah right away extends that. Kol habasar. It's not just the flesh of the kid, but any meat. And it's not just the mother's milk, it's any milk. And you're not allowed to cook the meat together with the milk, but the next statement of the Mishnah says, and don't put meat and cheese on the same table. Okay? So we're already getting a lot closer to having two separate sinks in your kitchen and two separate sets of dishes and cutlery. Okay? And waiting 6 hours between a meat meal and a dairy meal. Okay? Don't have them together on the same table. So you see that the sages have dramatically extended the idea. Now, that's also related to the nature of the prohibition, because when you look at the prohibition as it appears in 2 out of the 3 places in the Torah where it's brought together with bringing the first fruits to the temple, which gives you perhaps a sense that there's something ritual, something sanctified about basar b'chalav. Okay, and in fact, a well-known passage in the Rambam's guide is that idolatry had something to do with it. Perhaps such food was eaten at one of the ceremonies of their cult or at one of their festivals. A confirmation of this may be found in the fact that the prohibition occurs near the commandment concerning pilgrimage. Some contemporary scholars have tried to confirm the Rambam's hunch from an ancient source. I believe it's an Akkadian source, although other scholars have argued that I don't know Akkadian, so I can't confirm or disconfirm, but scholars whom I respect have claimed that that's not what the source actually said, and so we don't really have any hard evidence that this was in fact used in some kind of pagan ritual. Okay, but the Rambam is correct that the context in the Torah might indicate that. But a very common explanation, first suggested by Philo, okay, in ancient times, and then Ibn Ezra and many other commentators following that, explain it as yet another explanation of our care to give expression to our humanity. Okay, meat and milk represents motherhood. Milk represents giving life. Meat represents taking the life. Meat and milk should be kept separate. Okay, we want milk to remain a source of life, not something that enables us to eat dead flesh. Okay, and so this is again here in Philo's language, incurring the double reproach of humanity and impiety. Okay, so he says this really expresses just going too far in our act of exploiting the animal for the sake of consuming it. Now, something of that gets lost, okay, when we say it's not just the kid and not just the mother, but I think the idea could still be maintained, okay? Meat and milk per se, not just the kid's meat and the mother's milk. Meat and milk per se should be kept apart. And Chazal went very far in keeping them apart. Now, this prohibition appears twice. First, in the first Mishnah, and again, this is what's marked off in the blue lettering in the end of Mishnah Gimel. Amaleh tofim agvina ala shulchan eino over below taseh. Yes, it's prohibited, but it is not. It's only rabbinically prohibited, not prohibited by Torah law. And the second part of the chapter then explains why. Because the meat of the meat of a bird, a poultry, is not forbidden by Torah law. It's only forbidden by rabbinic law. Okay, so this idea that opens and closes the first three mishnayot, is also a segue into the explanation as to the limits. You have in Mishnah Daled, Rabbi Akiva Omer Chayav Ha'of Einan Min HaTorah. Not only are fowl not only are fowl, poultry, not included in the prohibition of meat and milk, but also non-domestic animals. Okay, this again harks back to what we saw in the mitzvah of kisui hadam, covering the blood, right? So covering the blood applies only to chayav ha'of. Meat and milk, by Torah law, does not apply at all to chayav ha'of. So the same chayav ha'of that are included here are excluded there. So in a certain sense, you can see chapter 8 playing off of chapter 6.
6.
Okay. And here as well, the chapter, second half of the chapter opens with B'sar Beimat Tahorah versus and Chalev Beimat Tahorah, as opposed to Beimat Torah and Chalev Beimat Tmeah, and concludes with Shadam Noheg Ba'Beimah V'Chaya Ba'Ofot Bein Tmeah Bein Torah V'Chelev Eno Noheg Ela Ba'Beimat Torah Bilvad. Other commandments discussed at the end of the chapter, where we also differentiate between Beimat Torah and Beimat Tmeah. So we open and close the second half with differentiating between kosher animals and non-kosher animals. Okay, so that again marks off these three mishnayot as a unit of three. Okay, now there are a lot of other points we could pick up on in the structure of the chapter. Let's just focus on two very salient points that I've marked off here with the color coding. Okay, let's look at Mishnah 3. Okay, the third to last line of Mishnah 3. Hakchal, that's the udder of the cow. Okay, now there's a problem with roasting or cooking the udder, namely,
it has milk in it.
It has milk in it. Okay, so now the milk inside the udder is halachically not fully considered milk. It's only rabbinically considered milk, because milk means when it's been milked, when you took it out of the body of the cow. When the milk is still in the body of the cow, okay, or the goat, whatever it is, then it is halachically not a problem. But rabbinically, it is a problem. It's another rabbinic extension. So, what do we have to do to eat the udder? Before you cook it,
You have to squeeze it.
You have to tear it apart before you squeeze out the milk. And lo kra'o eino over alav. But if you didn't do that, then you don't violate a Torah prohibition, because it's only rabbinically forbidden. And now, interestingly, the Mishnah jumps to halev, the heart. What's the problem with roasting or cooking the heart?
It's full of blood.
It's full of blood. You're also not allowed to consume blood. So what you do, kor'o motzi et damo.
You You crisscross it and try to get all the blood out.
Okay, again, you do the same thing that you did with the chal. It's the exact same language. And lo kra'o eino over alav. Because apparently blood
But
as well is only prohibited, fully prohibited by Torah law when it is not absorbed in the walls of the organ. Okay? We rabbinically insist on drawing out as much of the blood as we can from all of the organs, but by Torah law, were you to eat the heart without first removing all the blood, it would not be prohibited by Torah law, only by rabbinic law. So these two laws really go together. But this creates a very interesting equation that's worth pondering. Is there some underlying, other than the fact that they both have laws that are expressed in similar laws, expressed in similar language, is there something that connects the prohibition of meat and milk and the prohibition of eating blood?
could you repeat that? I'm sorry.
Is there some underlying connection other than the kind of technical connection, which is they both have similar laws expressed in similar language, but do they have some kind of underlying common core? Why can't we consume blood?
Ki adam hu hanefesh.
It's our respect for the life force. Blood and milk are both life forces.
Life-giving, right.
And we should treat them as life-giving. And when we consume the blood, we are abrogating that principle. And when we consume the milk together with the meat, then we are also violating that principle. And I think Chazal here are giving expression to the idea that we saw in Philo and Ibn Ezra. Okay, that indeed meat and milk is very much a principle of giving respect to life, giving respect to the life force. Okay, encouraging our humaneness and compassion, even while we're consuming the flesh of an animal. And there's another very interesting parallel that links them. Notice I have the same color coding in the last Mishnah of the second section. Chomer b'chelev mibadam. If in Mishnah 3 we relate blood to milk, in Mishnah 6 we relate blood to certain fats. The chelev represents the forbidden fats. The Torah forbids blood and chelev for similar reasons. They are both supposed to be offered on the altar. Okay? The blood, besides being offered on the altar, also symbolically represents life. Chelev is the part of the sacrifice that, for virtually all sacrifices, is offered on the altar to God.
Kulal Hashem, right.
Okay? And therefore it is prohibited to men. So the Mishnah quite naturally compares chelev to dam. Now chelev is a word that sounds an awful lot like chalav. So if in Mishnah 3 we're comparing chalav to dam, in Mishnah 6 we're comparing chelev to dam. Okay, and that's what you see here in this chart. Within Mishnah 3, we're comparing the milk and the blood, and in the ends of the two halves of the chapter, okay, we are comparing blood to milk on the one side and to chelev on the other side, and so this gives the chapter, I think, a very very, very powerful, very, very
Parallel.
powerful arranging force. Okay, I think we didn't get to too much of the content of chapters 9 and 10, but you can fill that in from the source sheets if you, okay, in the source sheets I noted both where chapters 9 and 10 echo other mishnayot in Masechet Hullin, and where these chapters are either looking back to Tractates Zvachim, okay, again playing off of Zvachim. What we say about Hullin in these chapters somehow reflects other kind of parallel laws that we encountered regarding sacrifices in Tractates Zvachim, and how these chapters are looking forward to Tractate Bechorot. Okay, we already talked a bit about how we're talking about gifts to the Kohen, which already sort of orients us towards the next Tractate Bechorot. There's some very interesting parallels that link the two tractates as well, but I'll leave that for all of you as homework, and with that, we'll conclude our study together of Tractate Hullin, and
Yeshkoyach. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you very much, Rabbi Walfish. I am just going to stop the screen sharing. I do want to let people know that while we have finished with Hullin, Bechorot is next. In theory, you could sign up at drisha.org/classes. If it is not working today, please try again another day. Worth noting, Bechorot is going to be taught by Rabbi John Kelson, and it will be asynchronous in that you will receive an email once a week. You will get emailed the class recording, and you're welcome to follow along at your own time, reach out with questions, and we'll resume for live shiurim in later classes. Thank you very much. Siyamti. Take care.